What's up guys, Agent here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Stamina Necromancer. So the Stamina Necromancer plays very similarly to the Stamina Warden. It's pretty much identical to how the Magicka Necromancer plays very similarly to the Magicka Warden. The Warden's rotation is centered around using Shulks. The Necromancer rotations are centered around using Blast Bones. However, unlike the Magicka spec, Stamina Necromancers, because you're within melee range, have a much easier time with their rotation. You don't have to deal with this sort of weird timing with Blast Bones like the Magicka Necromancer does when playing at range. You kind of have that advantage going for you there. So if you guys are very used to the Stamina Warden rotation, you guys will be pretty much right at home here with the Stamina Necromancer rotation. It's all centered around the Blast Bones, so as long as you're used to basically using Shulks every 3 abilities, then you should be very easily adapted to the Stamina Necromancer rotation where it's using Blast Bones every 3rd ability instead. Like the rest of our build videos, we'll be going over gear, skills, attributes, everything you need to know to basically recreate this build yourself. I will be talking a little bit about some gear substitutions you might want to make depending on the specific trial you're running and the specific fight. And then from there we will talk about our rotation, just kind of demonstrate that on a 6 million dummy so you guys get an idea of the sort of theory crafting behind the rotation, how to sort of prioritize things on your rotation, and then we'll close things off with a 21 million raid dummy parse so you guys can get a point of comparison to other classes. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started here first with our gear. So gear-wise, pretty similar to other Stamina DPS, as you can expect as an endgame PvE player. Builds pretty much start to look very similar at this level of play. But again, there are a couple of substitutions that you might want to consider making depending on a specific fight, and those substitutions are going to vary quite a bit depending on sort of what level of rating you are at. For Monster Helm, no question here, Velidreth is still top of the line for Stamina DPS. There hasn't been any sort of Monster Helm that has been released yet that has been able to top Velidreth's. So this comes from Cradle of Shadows, so you do need to have access to the Shadows of the Hiss DLC in order to grab this set. There are a few other options for Monster Helm sets, but none of them perform quite as well as Velidreth, and we'll be explaining why once we go over some gear substitutions. For the body set, we're still running Relequens. It's still the strongest set in the game for Stamina DPS. There's really no other set that really matches Relequen in terms of just how much DPS it's able to provide for us. The perfected version here is obviously going to be stronger than the imperfect version. The difference is that 1096 max stamina on the perfect version. But the imperfect version is still pretty strong by itself as well. So the perfect version of Relequen does come from Cloud Rest plus 1, 2, or 3 on Veteran, but the imperfect version drops from all the side bosses, even on Vet, as well as in normal Cloud Rest. So you can farm whichever one happens to be more achievable for you. So if you can't really find a group that can clear Vet Cloud Rest plus 1 consistently, then you can stick with imperfect Relequen here. Not much of a difference because that 5-piece is just max stamina compared to something like weapon crit or weapon damage. For our front bar set, we are running perfected Lokkestiiz. This comes from the new Trial Sunspire, so you do need to have access to Elsweyr to run this set. The perfected version adds weapon crits, so the perfected version of Lokkestiiz is definitely stronger than the imperfect version, very similar to Relequen, but the gap is a little bit bigger between the imperfect and perfected version just because it is weapon crit now rather than max stam. That being said, because it is a front bar set, we're not really going to be seeing too much of a difference, so if you are running Lokkestiiz as a front bar set, the imperfect version will do just fine. So the perfected version, unlike Cloud Rest, you just need to clear normal Vet Sunspire in order to grab these pieces, so you don't need to do any of the hard modes in order to get the perfected pieces. Doing the hard modes just increases the quantity of the drops that you get, so you get double drops if you manage to kill bosses on hard mode. In terms of weapons, we're going with double daggers still on the front bar. We're going with 2 sharpened here. You can also go with nirn on the main hand, just adjust your blue CPs accordingly to make up for the loss of penetration. We are running double ravage health poisons here, and that is because they have fixed a bug where poisons were decreasing the effectiveness of our back bar enchant. So now that that bug is fixed, we're able to run poisons now on the front bar here. So your enchants don't really matter for your daggers because you will be replacing them with poisons. Back bar running an Infused Maelstrom Bow with a weapon damage enchant. Now for our jewelry traits, 3 Bloodthirsty is going to be the strongest option here with 3 weapon damage enchants. You can also go with Infused if you would like. That'll give you some more DPS over the entire fight in terms of average DPS, versus Bloodthirsty, which gives you a very large boost towards the last 25% of the fight. There are a few fights where Infused is going to be stronger than Bloodthirsty, or at least more useful than Bloodthirsty, but 3 Bloodthirsty is in general going to be stronger than 3 Infused. For our armor, we're going with Ulse, medium armor, and all max stamina enchants, and all divines. So we are not running any heavy pieces here with our monster helm set, and that is because necromancers do have some additional health through their passive Last Gasp, which gives an additional 1250 max health. So we're able to basically run regen food without really having to worry too much about our max health here. Even on a dark elf with no additional health passive on our racials, we're still able to meet the required health, or I should say recommended health, for vet trials once we have either Ebon or Minor Toughness. Now, in terms of other sets that you might want to run, we'll start off with monster helm sets, and then we'll take a look at the other sets in the game. Starting off first with monster helms, it'll be easier if I just go ahead and do this. There are basically 2 other monster helm sets that are going to be potentially used depending on your sort of sustain status, as well as whether or not you're able to use Velidreth or not. First one's going to be Kra'gh. This is a base game set from Fallen Grotto 1, so this really is more used for the 1-piece at physical penetration, combined with 1-piece Velidreth for the weapon damage on Velidreth. The proc itself is not particularly strong. It is at the very least consistent because it procs on any damage, but by itself it's not very strong, not very consistent, because you do need to be basically right up against the enemy in order to get this to proc. So overall, you do want to get at least 1 piece of proc for the potential combination of 1-piece Kra'gh, 1-piece Velidreth, but it's not something that I would consider essential. The other set that you might want to consider running is going to be Selene's. This is going to be the base game set you're going to run if you can't get Velidreth. So this comes from Selene's web, and when you compare it to Velidreth in terms of actual DPS, Selene's does lose out because that 1 piece is max stamina compared to weapon damage, but the proc itself does proc more often, so overall Selene's is pretty comparable to Velidreth, just a little bit weaker, but Velidreth does win out simply because that 1 piece is weapon damage, plus the Velidreth proc can hit multiple times on the same boss, provided the hitbox is large enough. Selene's will only ever hit once. In addition, Selene's will proc off of only direct melee damage, so it's a little bit more constrained than the Velidreth proc. But if you do not have access to Velidreth, then Selene's is pretty much one of your only options. And then finally, Stormfist is another option you might want to have on the table, but it is definitely weaker than Selene's and Velidreth's, mainly because that 1 piece just adds stamina regen. So in terms of sustain, Stormfist is really strong. It does give you some additional regen, and that is affected by things like major and minor endurance, but the proc itself is fairly weak overall compared to Selene's and Velidreth's, plus there is the potential for whatever enemy that happens to be caught in the proc to run out of the proc, basically wasting the damage from that proc itself. So Stormfist definitely weaker than Selene's and Velidreth, but if you have trouble sustaining, it is a decent option to run instead. Now, in terms of other sets you can run, so there are a few other sets that you're going to want to have on hand, because obviously Relequen is not going to be good for example, fights where you're changing targets very often, but Lokkestiiz is really good no matter what, but for those of you guys who don't have Elsweyr, obviously you cannot get Lokkestiiz because you can't access the trial to get it. So there are a few sets that I do want to mention here that you might want to consider picking up. So under the dungeon sets, you can, if you would like, pick up Leviathan. Now, with Necromancer specifically, because you have high crit chance in Execute, Leviathan does lose a lot of power in Execute, but it does retain its strength over that first 75% of the boss's health. So this can be found in Crypt of Hearts. It's a medium armor set, so you can get it from as a body or armor. I should say armor or jewelry. I would not use it as weapons because the 5-piece is static, and again, it is weaker on a stamina Necromancer compared to other classes because Necromancers do get additional crit chance in below 25% health. So Leviathan's is not really going to be quite as strong as some other sets or compared to some other classes. Moving on here, there aren't really that many dungeon sets out there that are good. Sogman's Warband is another set that I would recommend picking up here, particularly if you are interested in potentially doing a bow build later on down the line. This is basically what I would like to call a modified version of Advancing Yokeda, which we'll talk about in a little bit. This comes from Frostvault, so you do need to have access to the latest DLC, dungeon DLC I should say, Wrathstone. So basically add some weapon crit. We get up to 10 stacks of 129 weapon crit each, so it stacks up to 1290 weapon crit, which is roughly about 6% weapon crit or so. Maybe a little bit less than that, but when you get all 10 stacks, you also gain minor force. So this is the buff that typically you get from Rearming Trap. So running Zogbyns basically allows you to drop Rearming Trap and put on another ability there. So you get an ability slot back for running Zogbyns. Zogbyns also does have physical penetration as the 4-piece, so that does give you a little bit of additional wiggle room when it comes to how you want to adjust your CPs. That being said, if you are running Zogbyns as a front bar set, it's very easy to maintain because it lasts for 10 seconds, but you will be losing that physical penetration on the back bar. It's not that big of a deal because most of your back bar will dynamically update when you go to your front bar and gain that physical penetration back, but it's just something you want to keep in mind here. Moving back over to overland sets, there are a handful of overland sets that you might also want to consider picking up. Brigands Thorn is one of them, so this comes from Bankarai. Base game set just adds a lot of physical penetration. Going to be more useful in trash pulls where you cannot reliably get major fracture on everything, or alkosh on everything, so that way you'll get consistent physical penetration. But in terms of boss fights, Brigands is definitely not a set you want to run because you will typically be able to meet that penetration cap without using Brigands. Beyond that, that's Briarheart. This is a set from Hrothgar, but this is an overland set, so if you don't have access to the Hrothgar DLC, you can just buy it off Guild Traders. This is a proc set, so you can wear this on the front bar. You don't have to wear this on the body if you don't want to. Basically acts sort of as a weapon damage proc. When you proc it, proc off of critical damage, it increases your weapon damage by 449 for 10 seconds. Now this will carry over to the back bar, so pretty nice there. In addition, while that proc is active, you also get healed whenever you do a critical strike. Now in terms of the effective weapon damage you get from the set, it is pretty much very similar to Hunding's Rage, which is a crafted set, but because Briarheart is a proc instead of a static bonus, it does carry over to your back bar, so Briarheart does do more damage overall compared to Hunding's Rage. Speaking of Hunding's Rage, it is a set that you're going to want to have on hand as well. Very consistent, very easy set to obtain. So Hunding's Rage, crafted set, requires you to know 6 traits, or you can get someone to craft it for you, or buy it off of Guild Traders. A static bonus, so you do want to have this on the body, so that way you're not losing the static bonus on your back bar. But run this on the front bar nonetheless, but it's definitely going to be better off as a body set. So again, very consistent set, not quite as strong as some other sets in the game, but it is definitely a very solid set that even endgame PvE players still hold on to in those situations where there's not really any other good sets out there to run. Moving on to trial sets now. There are a few trial sets here you're going to want to pick up as a Necromancer. So the first one's going to be Twice Fang Serpent, also known as Twice Fang Snake, from Sanctum Ophidia. So base game set. It's basically a little bit of a stronger version of Brigands. So this is again best used very similar to Brigands in trash pulls where you cannot necessarily get major fracture or alkosh on everything. And then you have Vicious Serpent, also known as Vicious Ophidian. So this comes from any of the Kra'gh trials. Very consistent set. Again, you get the Minor Slayer bonus as a Slayer set. Also gives you some nice sustain, reduces the cost of your stamina abilities by 8%. Stamina Necromancers do have a little bit of a challenge when it comes to sustain, and we'll talk about that a little bit when we go over the Parse information. But the additional reduction cost from Vicious Serpent is very nice in overall helping your sustain. Now, ideally you want this as a body, but you can also run this as a front bar set as well. So it's kind of up to you how you want to run with that. Finally, there is one other set that I want to talk about here, but it does require you to transmute it. This is going to be Berserking Warrior, also known as Advanced Neokada. This comes from Halra Citadel, base game set, but because you do have to transmute it, because it's a heavy armor set, you will need to have access to Somerset and jewelry crafting in order to transmute and use this set to its fullest potential. So they did change it a little bit in Elsweyr, so now the buff lasts for 6 seconds, but the stack can only occur every half second. So it's a little bit easier to maintain, so instead of 3 global cooldowns on the back bar, you can do 4 global cooldowns on the back bar, but because you're basically focused around Blast Bones, maintaining Berserking Warrior is not going to be that big of an issue. Now, there are 2 sets that I do want to mention that are not going to be quite as strong, mainly because you do need to transmute them, and so there are other sets out there that are easier to obtain that you don't need to transmute. So first, going to be Baled Heritance. This is a heavy armor set in Auradon. It does say medium armor here, but it is heavy armor, so don't mistake that at all. The downside of Baled Heritance is, again, it's heavy armor, you got to transmute it, and the 3-piece adds physical resistance, which doesn't help out your DPS. But in a pinch, it could do. It's pretty cheap to get, so if you want to go ahead and use your transmute, you certainly can, but it's not as strong as the other medium armor sets that I've mentioned. The last one is going to be, find it, going to be a Ravager. Again, heavy armor set, Cyrodiil set, so you can purchase it off of guild traders, but again, heavy armor means you gotta transmute it. There are other medium armor sets that are easier to obtain compared to Ravager, but in a pinch, Ravager does work decently well. Very similarly to Baled Heritance, the 3-piece doesn't do you any favors in the DPS department, but it does give you a little bit of additional survivability. That's pretty much it for all the different sets in the game that you might want to pick up. So, for example, if you can't run Relequen, you could also run Lokkestiiz on the body set and then run something like Advanced Yokeda on the front bar. That's kind of up to you how you want to mix and match certain sets. Remember that Advanced Yokeda, Ravager, and Veiled Heritance are heavy armor sets, so in order to run them, you can only run jewelry and weapons, and you must transmute the jewelry because they will only come in healthy, which is obviously not very good for DPS. Moving on to our character sheet. I am a Dark Elf. Dark Elves and Orcs are going to be the two best races. So Orcs get 2,000 max stamina, 1,000 max health, and 258 additional weapon damage. So Orcs do get some additional beefiness, a little bit of additional survivability, which allows you to run regen food very well. Dark Elves get 1875 max stamina and 258 weapon damage, but they also get the same magicka and spell damage as well. So if you want to flip-flop between magicka and stamina DPS, Dark Elves are a very good option. You can also run what I like to call the sustain races. That's Redguards and Bosmer, the Wood Elves. They both get 2,000 max stamina. The Redguards get, I believe, 900 stamina back on direct damage every, I believe, 6 seconds. Those numbers might be off a little bit, but to basically get some stamina back whenever you deal damage. So that helps out your sustain. Bosmer get 258 additional stamina regen. So both of these races have very good sustain, but they do not have the additional weapon damage that Dark Elves and Orcs have. So they do end up losing out in terms of DPS. And finally, if you do want to play Necromancer but be able to dabble in both tanking, magic DPS, healing, basically all the different roles in the game, Khajiits are a very good option there for those of you guys who kind of want a jack of all trades, a very flexible sort of class / character. So Khajiits get 825 magicka health and stamina, they get 85 magicka stamina regen, 10% health regen, and they get 10% additional critical healing done and critical damage done. As you can see, Khajiits very well balanced across all the different roles. They are not going to excel or necessarily be the best in any of these roles, but because of that additional flexibility, it does allow you to play these different roles equally well. In terms of attributes, all points into stamina, we have that Blast Gas passive, that additional health from the Necromancer passive, so we don't really need to put any points in the health. You can certainly do so if you want some additional survivability, but it's not really necessary here. For our Mundstone, we're going with the Shadow, still the strongest Mundstone in the game for DPS. We're running our Tamed Takeaway Broth. This is the regen food, the gold food. We do need a little bit of that additional regen. Unfortunately, Stamina Necromancers do have a little bit of a challenge with sustaining their overall rotation. There are ways around it, and I'll show you guys some of the different ways that I thought up of and other people have thought up of to kind of combat this sustain issue, but it's just easier to just use our Tamed Takeaway Broth. Because of the additional health passive here, we're sitting at a pretty decent 16,250 health as a Dark Elf. So as an Orc, you would have a little bit more health than this. Once we get Minor Toughness or Evan, we'd be sitting at around 17k health or so, which does, is a good recommended health level for vet trials. So even though it does say 16,000, once we get all of our buffs in place, we are sitting pretty nicely. Once we do the 21 million dummy parse and get Minor Toughness, you'll see how much health we're going to get. We are a vampire for the 10% additional magicka regen and stamina regen, as well as the undeath passive. Just bear in mind you won't be taking more damage from fire, so in those fights where there is flame damage, just be a little bit more mindful of mechanics and make sure to get out of damage more quickly because of your vampirism. Onwards to skills. For our front bar here, we have Rending Slashes, Venom Skull, Blighted Blastbones, Detonating Siphon, Rearming Trap, and Flawless Dawnbreaker. On our back bar, Razor Caltrops Poison Injection, Endless Hail, the bread and butter of stamina DPS. This is a flex spot technically, so I have Avid Boneyard, and I'll talk about this a little bit when we go over our parse, kind of what sort of flex spots you can put in here. Skeletal Archer and Pestilent Colossus. In terms of flex spots, Avid Boneyard is one option. The other option is going to be Summoner's Armor. Third option is going to be Mortal Coil. So this flex spot here is really for your sustain. Avid Boneyard gives you additional synergy with Pairs nicely with the Undaunted passive Undaunted command, so you get 4% of your stamina back, so basically gives you a 1225 stamina every 20 seconds with Avid Boneyard. Summoner's Armor reduces the cost of Blast Bones, Skeletal Mage, and Spirit Mender by 12%, so basically makes your Blast Bones cheaper, which is going to be your primary spammable, so again helps out sustain that way. The Mortal Coil just returns straight up stamina, so 2844 stamina over 12 seconds. In terms of overall boost sustain, Mortal Coil is going to be the winner here, followed by Avid Boneyard and then Summoner's Armor. I prefer Avid Boneyard because it also deals some damage, and as we can see here, it's actually not that bad. So without any buffs or anything like that, we're already sitting at probably around 10k, not 10k, 1k DPS just from the dot that Avid Boneyard has, and once we include the Grave Robber synergy, synergies do scale off of your highest stats, so the synergy is actually pretty strong overall. Gives you an additional almost 11,000 once you get buffed up by potions and other sort of buffs. It'll only increase from there. So Avid Boneyard is definitely my preferred way to sustain on a stamina Necromancer. Now for our CP points, they have not changed the cap. It is still 810, so we have the same amount of CPs as before, 270 across each of the 3 different constellation colors. With green CPs, 100 Moon Cap, 75 Tenacity is what I got, and then that leaves 95 points. So I have 31 Shadow Word, 31 Tumbling, and 33 Warlord. You can shift these points around however you like. For example, you can push Tenacity up to 100. You can drop Mooncap to 75 to get some more points back. If you feel your sustain is fine, kind of up to you how you want to play around with that. For blue CPs, this is with 2 sharpened daggers. So if you have Nirn sharpened, so Nirn main hand sharpened offhand, you will need to put some more points in the piercing. Additionally, we are assuming you're able to get pretty much all the debuffs in the game. So Torque's Infused Crusher, Alkosh, so on and so forth, at very good uptimes. So if you can't get good uptimes, or if you're missing, for example, you're only running Infused Crusher, not Torque's Infused Crusher, very similarly to running Nirn Sharpened, you will need to put a few more points into piercing. So 64 Mighty, 37 Piercing, 61 Precise Strikes, 52 Thaumaturge, and 56 Mastered Arms is if you have double sharpened and you have all your debuffs going at very good uptimes. Now if you need to drop some points out, the 2 next lowest jump points are 56 and 49 for Mighty. Precise Strikes can be dropped down to either 56, 52, or 48. Thaumaturge down to 48. Mastered Arms 52 or 48, and that should give you a couple of points to play around with in piercing. Also keep in mind you can run something like 1 piece Kra'gh for the penetration, and then 1 piece Velidreth, or you can run Sogman's Warband instead of whatever your front bar set is for just penetration that way. So there are ways to get around this sort of pen issue here on Stamina DPS. Finally, our red CPs. This is a generalist approach, so this will give you pretty decent mitigation across all pieces of content, but not the best across any single piece of content. 81 Ironclad, 61 Thickskin, and 64 into Hardy and Elemental Defender. So that's pretty much all of the build information. Now let's go ahead and go over our parse. So, like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, Stamina Necromancer, your rotation is pretty much very similar to Stamina Wardens. You do have a few other abilities you want to keep track of, but for the most part, you're going to be centered around stalking Blighted Blast Bones. So this basically acts as your Shulks, the Necromancer version of Shulks. So it summons after 2.5 seconds, and if you're in melee range, it just explodes immediately. Now, if you're not within melee range, it does need to run to the whatever you're targeting, so there is some additional downtime there, but because you're in melee range, you will be able to use this every 3rd ability cast. So again, very similar to Stamina Wardens there, your rotation is centered around this one ability that is basically eats up 3 global cooldowns before it hits something. So it's going to be Blast Bones 2 abilities, Blast Bones 2 abilities, and so on and so forth. So you do need to pay a little bit of close attention to the corpse system here, because Detonating Siphon, you can only activate this if you have a corpse active. Avid Boneyard will also consume a corpse, so just be mindful of whether you can use Siphon or not with Boneyard. If you're using Mortal Coil instead of Avid Boneyard, that also requires a corpse in order to be used. The good thing is Blast Bones will always create a corpse for you, so as long as you are obviously using Blast Bones as your main spammable, there should be no shortage of corpses for Detonating Siphon or Mortal Coil if you are using it. Skeletal Archer will also leave a corpse, and because Avid Boneyard is an AoE, sometimes it'll eat the Skeletal Archer corpse instead of the Blast Bone corpse, so that's a little bit of an advantage there with Avid Blast Bone. So, in terms of rotation, very similar to that of a Stamina Warden. You're really centered around that Blast Bones. So again, just want to put all your dots up, Now with Avid Boneyard, make sure that you are centered it on yourself. And again, it's every 2 abilities. So you will need to break up your back bar rotation in order to use Blast Bones. And that's just the nature of having to run Blast Bones there. Now there will be some downtime on your dots. Try to avoid that as best you can, but it is going to be unavoidable. There will be some downtime just because of the way Blast Bones works. Now, other than that, again, very similar to Stamina Wardens, just center your rotation around that Blast Bones. Every 3rd ability cast should be Blast Bones, as long as you're able to stick within melee range. Now in terms of ultimate, obviously you're going to be using your Pestilent Colossus ultimate. Get that back real quick. So this is going to be your ultimate of choice. Pretty strong ultimate, and do keep in mind that if you have multiple Necromancers in group, you will need to coordinate your ultimate, so that way you're not overlapping that major vulnerability debuff that it applies to whatever it is it's hitting. Very strong ultimate. You do need to let the entire sort of animation play out. You can't necessarily bar swap cancel out of the animation because it is an AoE. You have to wait until the AoE is placed before you can cancel out, bar swap cancel out of the animation itself. So you can't necessarily do something like with Dragon Knight standard where you can bar swap cancel out of the long animations. Just keep that in mind. Don't bar swap early, because if you do, you'll actually cancel the cast of the ultimate. You will not lose the ultimate, you just won't cast it. So now we're going to be doing a 21 million dummy parts so you guys can get an idea of the DPS that we're able to pull. Now before we start, I do want to mention here that no other class in the game has access to the major vulnerability, so we do need to adjust our parses downward to account for that debuff, and I will do that on the side. It's going to be on my second monitor, but I will do that math for you guys. I'll also include it down in the description below for you guys if you want to do it on your own parses that way. Another thing to consider is because we're using Lokkestiiz and we have our own synergy, our Lokkestiiz uptime is going to be higher than on other DPS. So also bear that in mind. Stamina Necromancers have some of the highest self-buffed parses because of the major vulnerability, and because if you are using Avid Boneyard, additional synergy for Lokkestiiz. Just bear that in mind. This parse is not necessarily directly comparable to that of other classes, but using the raid dummy does help normalize a lot of the different buffs that some classes have access to compared to others. So this is a pretty decent comparison, but you do have to adjust downward to account for the additional major Slayer uptime as well as the major vulnerability uptime. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So again, we're doing every second ability. Make sure you are activating your synergies on the front bars. You are front barring Lokkestiiz. If you're not front barring Lokkestiiz, so for example, oh, I seems like my Blast Bones suddenly became... Okay, so we need to redo the parse here just because Blast Bones bugged out. I might need to reset UI for this, depending on whether I can recast it or not. No, it's casted, so I will need to reload UI here. But something to keep in mind here is because of all the different dots you have in place, you will need to break up your rotation a lot. So it's a very dynamic rotation here. There's no one set rotation here for you to use. If for whatever reason your backbar dots are running out and you're kind of stuck between picking which dots to run, then Siphon is probably going to be the first one you're going to want to drop. You want to maintain Rearming Trap as best you can. Rending Slashes you can also drop potentially. It's a very strong dot. You don't want to drop it unnecessarily, but if you have to, you kind of have to. And then Avid Boneyard, obviously you don't need to maintain up the whole time. It's great if you can, but don't focus in on doing that. Okay, so that didn't help out. 1 second. Okay, there we go. So now let's do the parse again, this time for... So we did not manage to start with a See here what I mean with fast backward dots being a little bit tricky to maintain here. It's a very dynamic rotation. So we're dropping Siphon real fast here, prioritizing our backward dots. Notice that even though Venom Skull does seem like it should be your spamble, due to the sheer number of abilities we have to keep track of, it's really not going to be all that feasible to use Venom Skull too much. Your main spamble is going to be Blast Bones. This rotation actually is quite messy. I have had better rotations. Hopefully, because of the length of the parts itself, everything will even out and we'll get a decent number at the end here. See here just the sheer complexity of the Necromancer's rotation. Alright, so that is our parse. Again, I have had higher parses, and I've obviously seen higher parses from people who have a better grasp of the actual rotation itself. But for the purposes of here, we managed to do 90.7k. So again, we do need to adjust downward in order to adjust for major vulnerability here. And again, I'm doing this off screen, but I will have the entire equation down in the description below for you guys, so you can do this with your own parses, depending on how much major vulnerability uptime you have, as well as any other sort of additional buffs you might have, or I should say your specific parse. So that should be pretty. So once we adjust downward for the major vulnerability uptime, it's actually going to be closer to 88.3k in overall DPS. You also have to consider the Major Slayer uptime. Typically speaking, on other stamina DPS, you're taking a look at around 65% uptime on the Major Slayer. So if we also divide further by that and adjust even further, well, again, I'm doing this off screen, but I will add this in to the description below for you guys. So difference of about 20, just under 20, so 18% or so. And if we just downward for that, let me see if I did this math correctly. Add that in. A lot of parentheses. here. So when we just even downward for the Major Slayer uptime, we actually get around 84.5k DPS. This is a little bit of a conservative estimate because I'm not taking into consideration things like Minor Slayer and other sources of damage done and damage received. So it's probably going to be actually a little bit higher, probably closer to 85.5k rather than 84.5k. But nonetheless, 90.7k self buffs is pretty nice overall. Stamina Necromancers are definitely one of the strongest DPS in the game right now, just because of that major vulnerability that you're able to give with the Colossus ultimate. So that is it for this build video. Let me know down in the comment section below if you guys have any questions about this build, and I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. Again, you do need to take consideration Major Slayer uptime, and if you're using Lokkestiiz with Avid Boneyard, as well as the Major Vulnerability uptime if you want to compare it to other DPS. So for this particular parse, again, if you control for both factors, it's closer to about an 84.5k DPS, probably a little bit higher just because there are some other adjustments that I didn't really account for. If you want to adjust just for the Major Vulnerability, it's actually closer to about an 88.7k DPS there. Again, hope you guys found this video informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.